afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I am so thrilled for this opportunity to learn with you today and to be here with William and Derek and Michael. And we have quite the dispersed set of presenters today. Hey, William, where are you today?
I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio.
And Derek, how about you?
Wilmington, North Carolina.
Michael, where are you calling in from today?
I'm actually calling from Germany.
Wow. So we are all over, and we would love to find out where our attendees are today. And that will also give you a chance to get familiar with our question panel. Now, some of you were on before we started the broadcast and got to see all the fun that we were having as we prepared for today's event. And I know that you know how to use the question panel already. But for those of you who are not familiar with GoToWebinar, we'd love to hear where you're calling in from and see what type of international audience we have. We have someone from the UK, someone from Belgium, someone commenting, Michael, that it's probably 10 o'clock at night in Germany where you are?
6 p.m. at this stage.
6 p.m. We've got folks from Canada, from Scotland, from Alabama, Illinois, Arizona, Kansas City, Ohio, Virginia. I'm seeing all sorts of locations. Someone else in Michigan. Welcome, Rose in Michigan. Wow, thank you so much, all of you, for choosing to invest your time with us today. These three guys are some of the top experts from the world on the topic of communication, and they represent many, many years of experience in the work that they've done, and so we are just so privileged and thrilled to have them. A couple more things I want to let you know. We will be sharing today's slides as a PDF, and so I'll tell you that in advance. We are also recording today's event, and we'll share that recording with you later. Also, we have a giveaway. I don't know if you can see the books behind me, but we have some books that we will give away at the conclusion of today's event. So I encourage you to stick around until the very bitter end. It's not going to be a bitter end. It's going to be a happy end. Stick around till the end, and you'll find out how you can win a copy of the book that these three men have written, Be a Mindsetter. And one more thing, we would love to have you participate with us today and engage through social media. We're using the hashtag #BeAMindsetter, and we encourage you to use that as well as you're learning and growing with us today. So before we jump into today's content, I want to take just a quick moment to introduce these three gentlemen. We have first off William Greenwald, and he's representing the brain science on today's call. William is the founder and chief, let's see if I can say this, okay, everyone hang with me, chief neuroleaderologist. Yeah. Neuroleaderologist. I think that is a word that William made up. But it represents the work that he does with neuroscience and leadership. And his company is the Windsor Leadership Group. So William specializes in leveraging brain science to help leaders and organizations enhance their communication effectiveness and optimize employee engagement while making sure that he builds high-performing teams and service cultures. So again, welcome, William.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we also have Derek Roberts with us today. Derek, among other things, is the father of 6, going on 7 children, and I had to mention that. He has founded and served as the chief executive of Roberts Business Group and an executive partner with Integrity Solutions. Derek has spoken internationally and is an expert in the field of enhancing employee engagement and developing high-performance sales and service cultures. We also have Michael with us today, who has founded and served as CEO of 2 European enterprises. Since the 1990s, he has focused on training, leadership consulting, and launched an online learning platform designed to help individuals inspire, influence, and impact others. So wow, we have some amazing people with us today. So thanks again for joining us. I'm going to, at this point, turn things over to William and Derek, who are going to do the core of the conversation. And then at the end, Michael's going to join us again for some questions and answers. So please feel free to put those questions in your question panel throughout the event, and we'll get to those at the end of our session today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Becky.
So there's a 16-year-old boy that lives in the middle of Ohio, 5'4", 90 pounds, learning disability, struggles with school, struggles to find friends, struggles to fit in, starts going rogue on life a little bit and starts rebelling against his parents, rebelling against teachers. And at that point, the teachers start giving up on him, thinking that he just doesn't care enough for them to care about them. And parents don't really know what to do to try to bring a little bit more positivity and hope to the 16-year-old boy. And then something happens. Mr. Oliver. Well, who's Mr. Oliver? Well, Mr. Oliver is a teacher in the middle of Ohio who saw something in this boy, in this 16-year-old boy that nobody else saw, that all the other teachers missed. And that was something that he says was heart. Heart in this boy unlike anything he has ever seen. Beyond and past that facade of I don't care about you and I don't care about the school, was a boy that would rather take care of a child less fortunate than he instead of going to lunch. A boy that saw one of his female colleagues at school crying on the side of the steps and approaching her, asked her what was the matter, and she said, I'm overweight, pimples on my face, and nobody wants to take me to the prom. And he kind of chuckled and laughed and said, wow, that's your problem. That's easily solved. What are you doing at 8 o'clock? I'll come pick you up. We'll go to the prom together. You see, Mr. Oliver saw those types of behaviors, and he knew that there was something inside yearning to get out. And Mr. Oliver, 6 foot, black hair, brown eyes, big burly man, took his care and belief that was inside him as a teacher and bestowed it upon the 16-year-old boy. And over the course of 2 years, led with a simple message that was built around 2 aspects. The first, your life has meaning and your life has purpose. You may not see it now. The second, most critical, something he distilled in that boy almost every day. You are not worthless. Now think about that. A teacher instilling in a 16-year-old who's lost, who's gone rogue on life, who's rebelled against the world. And here's this teacher that steps in and says, so you're 5'4" and everybody else is taller. So what? So you got a learning disability. So what? Who cares? Everybody has problems, right? But through his care and belief, something magical happened in that 16-year-old boy, because over the course of 2 years and through his belief and care and willingness to step in and step up for that boy when no one else would at school, that boy graduated, which was a miracle because going back a few years, everybody thought he was just going to drop out in 10th grade. He graduated with honors. He graduated with straight A's. Imagine that. With his type of learning disability, you're lucky to get B's and C's even if you try as hard as you can. Straight A's. And here's the best part. When that 16-year-old boy, now 18, walked across the stage at graduation, parents were in the stands crying, recognizing it was just a few years ago. They were looking at trade schools in hopes he'd find something when he dropped out of school. But here he was, walking across the stage. Saw a little bit of a strut, a little bit of an ego look. But what Mr. Oliver knew, sitting on that stage, is that it wasn't an ego for this boy. It was a strut that projected to the world, I am not worthless. How cool is that? One teacher, one core message, you are not worthless. Fundamentally and foundationally impacted the trajectory of this boy's life forever. I ask, what does that story have to do with what we're here talking about? Well, my name is William Greenwald, and it is an absolute privilege for me to be here with my 2 co-authors, Derek and Michael, to unpackage the answer to that question over the next hour. We're going to go through 3 core themes with you, some at a high level, some more in immersion. We're going to talk about this idea of identity. We're going to talk about the idea of, what's it mean to mindset? And we're going to talk about the how-to. How do we communicate? We are humbled to be here today to talk about the book, which is about the how-to, but also to introduce some other things. And we're humbled mainly because we do feel like we're standing on the shoulders of giants. That people like Carol Dweck at Stanford that back in the 90s came out strong with this concept of growth mindset. And people like Matthew Lieberman and the authors of Vital Smarts, the Joseph Grennies, that have really tried to push this field forward in the spirit of positivity and inspiring and influence and impact in the life of others. And we hope that in our little way that we also can contribute to this field that we're calling the mindset movement. We want you to think differently today. We're going to challenge you, in fact, to think differently. We want to disrupt the way you think, the way that you act, the way that you intentionally make decisions about your ability, your capability to inspire and influence and impact those that you serve. And if we go back real quick to that story, one thing that Mr. Oliver, with so many other individuals like him, had one thing in common. That's an identity. The identity that they've chosen is a mindsetter identity. They purposely, and I use the word purposely intentionally, they intentionally and purposely choose, they elect to be a mindsetter. Just like some of you in leadership, we have to choose leadership every day. We either choose to be a leader or we don't. Well, same thing with being a mindsetter. The ability to inspire and influence and impact others, it's a choice. The question is, what is going to be your choice? What's your choice now? What's it going to be 60 minutes from now? We hope that through our conversations, which is what this call is going to be, just a conversation, right? A mini fireside chat talking about some really cool things that we trust will do two things. One, they're going to be relevant. That's our commitment to you. We want insights that we plant, the seeds that we plant for you, these insights, we want to make sure that they're relevant, not just brilliant, not just smart, not just research, but things that you can actually actionize and mobilize, which is the second commitment that we make to you. That when you get done in the next 60 minutes, you're going to leave with at least one thing that you decide you want to focus on, that you can immediately mobilize, an insight that you can actionize at home, at work, in your community, in your society, doesn't matter. That's our commitment to you. Now, I end by saying this. When we think about Mr. Oliver, we think about other mindsetters that have chosen this identity, chosen to be a mindsetter. There's three foundational principles that you're going to see is the arc of this entire hour. Three most important things. One, mindset matters. It does. The mindset that we bring to life, the mindset that we bring to any game matters. Sometimes it's the difference between ordinary and extraordinary. Second thing is mindsets can be shaped. Imagine that. Have you ever had somebody come in and give you a mindset reset when you needed it? That moment in your time, that moment in life that you just felt a little bit stuck and you didn't know how to get unstuck? And a family member, a friend, a colleague, they come in and they just say that one thing that just starts your brain on fire with aha connections. And you say, you know, you're right. I do need to do something different. I do need to change my behavior. I do need to change the worldview. Because that's what mindset is. It's the belief system that we bring to life that is shaped over time. It's shaped by your upbringing. It's shaped by your mentors. It's shaped by toxic leaders in our own organization. Sometimes not for the good. But true mindsetters, they know it is for the good because they understand that mindsets can be shaped. And the third thing, mindsetters make a difference. I can only look at Mr. Oliver. It's just one example of how mindsetters make a difference. One child, one message, you are not worthless. That's pretty cool. That's the train we're on. Derek?
Yeah, and so Bill, let me build upon that because I think for the purposes of today's discussion, let's drill down into, what is it that we want to take away from this? And as we've been on this journey for years. I mean, when you look at the histories of Bill and Michael and myself, really in executive communication, coaching, leadership communication throughout organizations, and really in all facets of life, we've taken that experience and coupled it with some of the greatest and latest brain science, and we've formulated in this an understanding of what it takes to be a really impactful communicator, really an intentional communicator. So much of what we do is many times just sharing, just dumping information. I mean, how many times do we share with, whether it's our kids, our colleagues, our coworkers, we're just spitting information at people. How often do we actually get through? And when we talk about mindset, this is a very intentional word for us. So Bill mentioned the word identity. I want to outline for you a couple of the areas that we're going to cover and really drill in. We talked about identity, and that's the mindsetter identity. And I'll explain more about the origins of that in a second. Then we talk about mindset. And it's important to understand that when you're a mindsetter, when you're a communicator, you're conveying from a particular lens. I mean, whether it's a leadership perspective, a leadership mindset, a parenting mindset, coaching, you have a bias to the communication. Now, that bias then influences not only what you say, but in many ways it also influences how you say it if you're not equipped. And the third part of what we cover here is the toolkit, and something that we've developed called the 3R axiom. And for the purposes of the discussion today, we want to focus on the first and the third. What does it mean to be a mindsetter in identity, and how do we equip you with the tools to do it? And so we're going to give you those tools and kind of unpack for you so that you walk away with, okay, this is the basic roadmap, the basic formula for highly effective engaged communication. But we want to first talk about the identity. Now, this middle piece, mindset, there's so much to be unpacked there. We could spend an entire day. In fact, we have entire workshops built around leadership mindset. You know, what does it mean to define and craft and understand your leadership mindset, from the purpose of being a leader to the principles that you derive from that, to the presence. You know, parenting, coaching, all of those things are more robust understanding of the content that you want to share. That's not the purpose of the day. We only have a brief period of time. Let's talk about being a mindsetter and how to communicate it effectively. Why mindsetter? What does it mean? Here is, in all of our engagements, I want to challenge you to really think about one very specific thing. What you say is a reflection of who you are, and how you do it is a derivative of what you believe, first and foremost. And as we talk about mindset being important and transferring and conveying that mindset, you know, so many of us that want to make an impact want to share effectively, but there's a step before that. And when we chose mindsetter as an identity, and I really would use that word identity. I mean, you talk about pace setters, you talk about trend setters. Really, we're talking about a mindsetter as a new identity. They'll use the word movement early on, and I'd really capitalize on that because I think we believe in a very powerful way that the next era of leadership, the next era of influence will really self-identify as mindsetters, because it is more than just simple transfer of information. It is an intentional engagement of the person that you are trying to impact. And here's what a mindsetter does. A mindsetter wakes up and says, you know what? I have an opportunity. In fact, I have a responsibility to impact others. It is a starting point belief. And being a mindsetter is something that frames everything else I do. I can be a mindsetter in all facets of my life. In fact, Becky mentioned I have 6 going on 7 children. Every day, my core responsibility is to be a mindsetter for my family. I have a couple of organizations that I work with and run, and every day it's my responsibility to influence and impact and inspire the people in those organizations. Now, if I don't have the mentality of a mindsetter, here's the risk I run into. I show up and I simply respond and react to the day. But as a mindsetter, I make a choice to show up and own the engagements that I am encountering. And I'll show you as we get into this 3R axiom that what you do in shaping your communication starts with what you believe. It starts with how you self-identify. And for us, the mindsetter movement, we believe, is actually a much bigger and broader engagement. So
Are you going to go?
we'll focus on that. The application of that is in the toolkit, the 3R axiom. And while we may be mindsetters in different facets of our life, in every one of those facets, we want to be effective in our communication. And so we started, just in an approach to this book, we said, what can be the most universally valuable tool that we can bring to people at large? And we wrote the book in sort of an everyman's way so that we could say, you know, these are the fundamental basic communication characteristics that will make you effective. And that's the 3R axiom. And so if we can inspire you to think differently, if you walk away next week and you catch yourself engaged in conversation and you say, you know what, was I really thoughtful? Was I intentional? Was I a mindsetter in that situation? I think in one respect we've done our job because we want to help you reframe that starting point. And then let's equip you now with the tool to actually execute on that and to make your conversations, to make your engagements. And conversation is not the totality of engagement. It's not the totality of influence, but is the most common. And so that's why we start with, in our book at least, this 3R axiom, this communication model, because we know that it's a foundational piece of this. It's what makes us engage others effectively. So let's unpack this axiom for you. And anytime you're formulating what you want to be is a mindset message, something that goes beyond just information, something that your recipient receives and takes ownership of, we're going to really challenge you to reduce that information and make it a simple, transferable, memorable message. The second part of that is we want to make sure that you relate that message to them in an effective way. That as you share, you're not sharing just what's relevant to you, that you're actively engaged in a conversation that puts it in their world, in their terms, in their frame. You relate it to them. The third part of the axiom is reflect. It's one thing to hand it off, but it's another thing to put them in a moment where they engage it. And asking the right questions and putting them in the right activities, that is where it becomes theirs, and they take ownership of it. So as you look at these 3 R's, yeah, Bill.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. The slides aren't flipping, and I'm not sure. I just wanted to point that out. See if there we go. Thank you.
I can't believe none of that. So thanks for catching that.
It's all good.
So reduce, relate, reflect. That's our 3R axiom. There's another piece of it, though, and we know it to be re-engage. If you don't get your message embedded and then reinforced and re-engaged, how many times have each of us, if you're a parent, have we said the same thing over and over and over? And I'm not talking about just the clean up the laundry in your room, but the life principles that we want to pass on to our kids. How many times does it take for us to impart those in significant and meaningful ways that it carries for them in a lifelong basis, on a lifelong basis? And that's what, this is about communicating with influence, impact, transforming people's lives. This is not just, just standing up and teaching. This is imparting. And I think that's the key characteristic here. And so let's take a look at this. And some of you may look at this and you go, Bill, Derek, every single one of those things, common sense, right? I mean, reduce your, make it simple, make it relatable, challenge people to own it. Absolutely common sense. And we would wholeheartedly agree with you. But the reality is that common sense is not always common practice. And we see so often over and over and over again that the ball drops when people when they miss elements of this process. So let's unpack the process for you in a very specific way and show you what it looks like to both formulate and engage your audience using the 3R axiom. So Bill, we're going to just talk back and forth. Bill brings a lot of the validation in brain science. This is not a model that we just sort of randomly concocted out of our head. This is a model that is a direct reflection of some of the greatest experience in science out there, validated to formulate an effective framework. So reducing your message is the starting point. Bill, why don't you tell us a little bit about that from a validations point of view?
Yeah, and this is really cool stuff. When you think about the brain science behind why do some messages stick? Why don't they, or why don't others that you want to let go of? There's those TV commercials, right? Why do they stick when you don't want them to stick? Well, there's a lot of science out there, and there's a lot of books been written, and we like to, in the spirit of reducing, there's some really cool science out there that we'd just like to share with you, some insights that really, I think for us, allows it to make sense, right? To understand one, simple is not easy.
When I'm done with the webinar, I'll tell you.
The ability to
be alone.
The ability to reduce your message, as we know, is not easy. To be able to take a paragraph, a page, and reduce it. or a 45-minute keynote maybe. And here's the challenge. Here's what we know. When you're delivering a message, regardless of the receiver, and it's perceived as complex, and maybe you haven't done a good enough job of reducing it, in the brain, it's perceived as a level of fear. So it would be analogous to walking down a dark alleyway and you hear footsteps in the back and your heart starts pounding and your adrenaline starts moving and your brain is saying, run, right? Well, guess what? When you're in a seat and you're receiving information and it's complex and it's starting to create some anxiety because you're thinking, I'm not sure what to do with this. And if this is your boss or your spouse or a dear friend, you're thinking, I don't know how to support or help and I'm lost and I don't want to raise my hand and say I'm lost. And well, that's fear in the brain. That's the fear mechanism. And guess what? Your brain is saying to run, just like it would in the dark alleyway. So we can think of the ability to reduce and the concept of keep it simple by saying if you don't, look at what you're doing to your receiver. You're making them run in their seats. That's not good. The second thing, when we look at the ability to make it simple, right, we want to make sure that that simple, reduced message is meaningful and purposeful to the receiver, that they understand how it connects to them. At this point, you're still talking to them, but they need to understand what it is that you're talking about. Think about just walking up to somebody and finishing a conversation that you started with another colleague right in the middle. They're going to say, what are you talking about? In fact, I've done that before where they'll say, you aren't talking to me, and they look clueless. Well, they are clueless, right? Well, that's analogous to not making sure that the receiver understands the meaning and purpose of what you're giving them. And if they don't understand meaning and purpose, the brain is not going to lock it into the longer term memory banks. It has no reason to store that information. We get a lot of information. We're hit with a lot of stimuli, boom, 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 right? All the time. In order for the brain to know and prioritize, hey, hold on to that. That may be something you want to use in the future. Well, brain needs to perceive it, and you need to be able to tell your brain consciously, hey, this is important. I better pay attention to this. This may be something I'm going to need to recall, right? When my spouse sits me down and says, put your computer down, we need to talk. Oh, my heart starts racing because I know that this conversation is going to go crucial, right? She just leveled the field. Well, guess what? My brain is going to remember that conversation. Whereas if she's just talking over a cup of coffee at Starbucks, well, I may not recall that a week later, right? So again, the importance of reducing your message through the lens of keeping it simple, making sure it's applicable, being meaningful and purposeful, that's going to increase and enhance your probability for memory recall and storage.
And so one of the things I think, Bill, that is so interesting about that is great messages stick with us, don't they? So we've got a few examples here of some known, what we think are known great reduced messages. And we're just going to put them up here. And I want you to read through. I want you to read through these. And if you will, in the chat window, just fill in the blanks, as many as you can. If you know the rest of this phrase, you can't judge a book by actions speak louder than, and when you think about these statements, Bill, what is it about these things that really, that make this so significant? Why are they so memorable as a reduced phrase or a reduced idea?
That's right. Yeah, and Derek, that's great too, because think about what we just talked about. I mean, one, these are simple, right? I mean, they're short. Remember, the brain cannot remember a paragraph, but it can remember a few words. We call that chunking, right? In the neuropsychology of memory, chunking it down to just a few chunks, a few data bytes, a few digits, a few words, right? You can't judge a book by poem, right? So most of us would be able to ramble these off. And the question is, you may have heard these 20 years ago. Why is it that your brain can easily recall this, but it can't recall what you had for dinner a week ago? What did you have for dinner last Saturday night? Right? Going to take some effort if you ever recall it at all. Right? But yet here we are. We can look at, you can't judge a book by its cover, right? Hopefully most of you got that, or maybe some of you did. But what a great, meaningful statement, right? So it goes back to, if I'm talking to one of my 4 children and I'm saying, look, you can't judge a book by its cover, has a lot of meaning to me, and that's a great metaphor. Metaphors are great for memory, by the way. That's one of the reasons why we remember it, because it means something, right? And that's why we always say in the presentation world, speak in metaphors, people will have a greater probability to remember. But the ability to find meaning and purpose through that, what does that mean to you? And it helps us tremendously. I mean, actions speak louder than words, right? We know that. Don't burn your bridges, right? The truth shall set you free. So I'd say it depends on who you're talking to, though. Give me liberty or give me death, right? I mean, these are 300 years old. And here we are remembering it. Clearly, marketing teams know this. This is why the Just Do It's of the world. It sticks. They know it works. And they're all turning to neuroscience and in the marketing world, for example, for that very reason. But can we not leverage this type of learning for our own messages? Right? Whether we're talking to our children about, don't drink and drive. It's bad, right? We know that, but the research tells us that kids that do drink and drive, they've heard that message a gazillion times from their parents and friends and family members, and yet they still do it. So, what is it about these statements then that really cause behavior change, right? How do we inspire somebody with our words, but make sure, as Derek was saying, that it leads to influence, the influencing the behavior that we need in that moment of truth, whether we're talking to that child, right, about don't drink and drive, and that moment of truth being when they get in their car and they turn on their keys after having a couple drinks, what do they do? Do they remember this message? But more importantly, we're going to talk about the 2 and the 3R that's going to help us make sure that behavior is influenced.
Yeah. And Bill, I think it's important here to remember that, just because you have, a pithy message doesn't mean that you get the impact. And you say that. It also doesn't mean that you have to have a pithy message. As long as it's clear and as long as you can articulate your objective in a solid and concise way. Pithy makes it memorable, sure. But you go back to the identity of being a mindsetter. This is not just me again spitting information. Every one of these statements, and those statements that are meaningful, we're talking about imparting a mindset. We want to connect with people at a substantive, meaningful, and sometimes life-changing level. That's the emphasis here. And so being a mindsetter starts well before my message. It starts in my own intent. It starts with how intentionally I engage this. And if I take time to boil this down and say, you know what, if I can only have them walk away with something, what is that something that is so significant? Because so often we try to say way too much in one setting. Let's take that one thing and then apply that one thing to the next couple of hours in the process. Because I think on its own, reduce is great, but it's insufficient.
And Derek,
it does not make you a mindsetter. Yes.
I'm sorry to walk on you, sir. Before we go to the next one, I was asked a great question after doing a keynote in Paris last month. And the question was, I get the tool. I have the book. It was great. I'm working through the how, but I'm not quite sure what I should be messaging on. I'm not quite sure what I should be mindsetting on. And I think that's a great call out as we think about, the idea of reducing your message. But what if you don't have a message? Well, what if you're not sure what you're mindsetting on, right? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, in life, right, we shape our own views of the world, right? We have our own life crucibles. We have those influences. Many of those things are somewhat embedded in us. But what is not addressed in this session is how do you cultivate the right parenting mindset? How do you cultivate the right leadership mindset? That's another area that we certainly touch on, and we have greater emphasis to. But finding time to mine those mindsets. Being a mindsetter means that I'm intentional about what I say. That means I've got to spend some time in self-reflection. I've got to spend some time really being clear and consistent and credible as an influencer to that. And so this identity of being a mindset, and we chose that for such a very specific reason, because it encompasses, intent. It really does. And it shows, that I've taken the time to be, intentional about finding that. And sometimes it's not always obvious, but the greatest mindsetters are clear on that. I mean, for example, we talk about Martin Luther King so many times showing up to deliver his address, the I Have a Dream address. Not something he sat down and spent an extraordinary long time crafting, but what he did do is he invested in being a mindsetter in his own identity. He knew that's what he was about. He knew what his message was innately, internally. And so the ability to deliver it actually in a 3R context came naturally, it flowed naturally because he had invested in being a mindsetter. And whether he called it that or not, but the identity of that, he showed up with a mentality of influence and purpose and impact, and that flowed out into practice. And so this is what we've gleaned from, and this is how we formulated this simple model so that others can practice it.
Yeah.
And in fact, so can we go to the relate? Because I think this is a really interesting part of the process, because so much once we've reduced our message, it is, what do we do with it now? How do we relate it to another individual? Because that is in the timeline of communication. As a mindsetter, I invest on the front end crafting it. Maybe it's a long time, maybe it's a little time, but it's that front end intentional effort. Now I've got to pass it on. The relate phase is such an important stage of that. How do I tell this in a way that is received well from my audience? And we use a little example here. We say, this is really kind of like the baton pass, right? It is, as you have one bit of information passing to the next bit of information. And Bill, you're apparently the receiver in this information here in the baton pass.
And I got a clean handoff. That's all I can say.
How significant is it to take your message and squarely put it into the hands and hearts and minds of your recipient? And how often do we drop that baton? I mean, I think about all the communication that I have had and still sometimes do have, whether it's colleagues or family or whatnot, where I have this, what I think is an important message, and I hand it off, and I continually hear a clang, clang, clang as that thing just bangs on the floor. I have missed that critical path to that audience, that recipient that I'm aiming for. And if you can't do that, then nothing else matters in this. So how we relate it to them is of paramount importance in doing that. So we actually have a question, a poll to ask you as a group. When you and Bill, you can carry this forward, but
yeah, I think it's a great question, and that is, what percentage of time do you feel like you effectively pass the baton in your communication?
And I've thrown up that poll for us, and we would love to see your answers. I'll give everybody a few minutes.
Yeah, and as we're filling that out, as Derek was saying, this is a challenge. This is something that is certainly common sense, but not always common practice. As Derek humbly said, and I can too, there's so many mistakes I've made. When I think back to my 25 years of leadership, how many times I communicated without the strategic intent of the late section of my communication, the ability to ensure that other person gets that aha moment, that, now I get what you're saying, versus just me saying, hey, this is really important to us, so just go out and do. The ability for somebody to own it, to get that aha moment, is so important to our ability to influence change, to influence behavior. It's not just, as we know, communicating. And it's also our ability, as we say, people follow the leader first, the message second. So it's also, when we think about relating and, going back to my own behavior, am I aligned to what I'm talking about? If I am talking to my children, for example, about the importance of not drinking and driving, am I going to the restaurant and having one beer but then getting in my car? And if so, what message is that sending? That you shouldn't do it at all, or one drink's okay? But that's the challenge, the ability to relate that message to that other person, to say, okay, I hear it's important to you. Let me make sure it's important to me. And we talk in the book, for example, a lot of strategies on how you can ensure that the receiver gets the baton, that you can hand it off successfully so that you don't drop it. Becky, can you see the percentages?
Yeah, I'm going to show you right now. Hold on just one second. Here we go. So it looks like I'll let you interpret those results. It doesn't look like anybody on this call thinks that they're always effective in passing the baton.
Absolutely. So we got some in that 25% range, 26 to 50, 51 to 75, and these are average. I think somewhere between that 26 to 75 is what we would typically see. And I think that does, and Derek, I'd love to get your thoughts, but I think for me, it does emphasize the important one, that we do have to practice this. You know, when we think about our ability to communicate and to craft and deliver messages that serve to inspire, influence, and impact, those that we serve over a sustained amount of time, it's hard work. It's hard stuff to master. And this is a great example of that, as it has been for me in my own life, at home and at work.
Hey, Derek, I'm going to pass this back to you. I think you're going to need to reshare your slideshow in slideshow mode when I hide this poll.
I can do that. Great. All right. Is my screen up again?
You're good. Thanks.
Great. So Bill, when we think about this, and we reduce it, and really that's a thoughtful, intentional act, and we make our simple, applicable, memorable message. Then we relate it, and really using examples, using stories, using interactivities, using whatever it is that gets our audience to really take grasp, to own this message in a way that, or at least if they don't own it, at least they can relate to it. Right? They can put themselves into that setting. And I know from a brain science perspective, there's so many things about brain associations and tying things together, really looking for memory, or associative handles. And so that becomes a critical trigger point, which leads us to this third step, and that is if, in fact, we can relate our message to them, at some point, the handoff, that message is almost entirely out of our hands. This last step is what we leave them with to finally take ownership of the message. And you see the timeline up above. It's the sender crafts it. There's an interaction between the two and relate. But by the time you get to reflect, it's that total handoff. And you're saying, will this survive? Will this last? And in fact, it's interesting in our book. One of the ways that we help the audience understand this is we tell a little story about a message called Sam. Right? Sam's in the brain of whoever the receiver is, and it's Sam's journey to survive, because at some point you got to let Sam go as a communicator. You got to let that message go and go, if I do these things well, what is it that's going to make that message embed? And the reflection part is probably one of the most critical elements of this whole equation. It's the difference between information transfer and impact. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And the ability to, and just think about it, this is, simple but not easy, but it is about making sure that the receiver can reflect upon what they've just related to, right? Through that, how would your life change if you did this? What would happen if you ran this marathon? What would happen if you changed the number of times you go to the gym, or the number of times per year you buy your spouse flowers? But the ability to self-reflect, there's two things that we've learned from brain science, and I think is really, really cool, right? Check this out. The first thing is when we reflect, it actually allows our brain to be more self-aware of our strengths and opportunities and our maladaptive behaviors, right? Because often we're blindsided by our own actions, but when we reflect, the brain kicks in. That's pretty cool. It allows us to be more self-aware. A key trait to any successful athlete, business leader, parent, self-awareness, right? Well, reflection can help us get there. The second thing brain science teaches us is that it better relates to our internal belief system. Remember earlier on, we said that this idea of a mindset and bringing your mindset to somebody else, it is about our internal belief systems that have been shaped over time by our parents, by our work, by our kids, and that shaping and that ability to transfer that mindset to somebody else through self-reflection. The person that's receiving the mindset that you're giving them is now self-reflecting on it. It now has the ability to kind of analyze how does that new mindset interplay with their internal belief system. And it does that often at the level of unconsciousness. And that's the best part of change, when it happens at the level of unconsciousness.
Yeah.
Love that stuff.
Yeah, well, and so when we think about this owning of the message, and if you can get it to embed, that's when it really becomes part of the recipient. And unfortunately, that's often not a one-time thing, right? You can have an inspiring message. You can have an impactful moment. You can brilliantly relate it to your audience through stories and examples, or challenge them in activities. And you can have that catalytic moment. But unfortunately, that catalytic moment is not always the totality of impact, because it is in constant competition. All the things that we're imparting, all these mindsets that we share, they are in constant competition with all kinds of other thoughts, ideas, other mindsets, other noise. And so while it's reduce, relate, reflect, and that is the message framework, it also requires us to consistently re-engage. Now, not every message requires re-engagement, but the significant ones that we can. And this is part of the intentional part of being, again, a mindsetter. This is something that I believe is so significant that I come back and retouch and re-engage in order to pass this on in a work environment. It's the rules that we operate by as an organization. It's the guidelines that we live our life by in a family. It's what we hope to pass on to another generation. It's those moments that we want to share, that critical engagement with somebody, and we hope it transforms them. But you know what? How much more impactful if we come back and retouch it? And here's the beauty of this. This is so steeped in evidence and research and science that we know this is where so much of the impact comes from.
That's right. It does. And again, reinforced by really cool, cutting edge brain science here. The two things that I would just share is that, one, the more we connect back to something, right? The more that we go back and say, okay, what did I learn last week? Let's just talk about a training class at work. If you sit there once and then you go back to your job, we know it has horrific memory recall rates. We go back to our old behaviors, nothing changes. We know that. But the more that we can go back and re-engage our receiver with the information we imparted on them last week, for example, whether it's through emails, through more face-to-face, through webinars, it makes the memory connection stronger. It makes the muscle stronger for recall, accurate recall, which then starts with retention, right? The ability to get it in and stick in our brains. The second thing is that I love to share, right, when we work with our clients, that the harder it is for people to recall, the harder you as the messenger make it for your receiver to try to go back and recall, the stronger the connection, the stronger the memory for the long term. What does that mean? Well, if I'm a facilitator, and I bring somebody back, another class back a week later, and sometimes it's okay, let's go back and rehash what we learned last week. Think about in academics even, right? In university settings. Typically as a facilitator, we often say, here's what we reviewed. And we give it to them. Well, instead of that, what if we say, I'm not going to give it to you. You tell me. And remember what I said, the harder it is to recall, the more we force somebody to say, you're really making me think about this. What did we talk about? That effort, the higher the effort, the stronger the connection. That's the departing wisdom there, right? The harder the effort to recall, the stronger the connection to memory. That's awesome insight, right? And it's not done well at all. We don't do that well in corporations, even with our own kids. I think about my own kids, how hard that is to do. I don't do that really well. I have to keep, right, that intentional purpose, right, to say I have to keep going back. And think about that don't drink and drive message, right? How many times, how often do we bring that back? What should they be doing in that moment? Not just don't drink and drive, but let's play it all out over and over again. Have them recall it. That's what we're talking about here. That's where impact, transformation occurs, right? It's not necessarily in the step 1 or 2 or 3. And Derek, you had a great setup there, right? It's in that re-engagement that you begin to build that foundation, right, of transformation and impact. That's really cool.
And the risk here is, Bill, that this is deceptively simple, right? It looks like just such a no-brainer. Reduce, relate, reflect, of course, re-engage. The more you retell, the more you engage. All of these things seem so fundamental, and yet every one of these drilled down is robust. And we take great efforts in the book to unpack every one of these things and say, look, what does a reduced message really look like, and why, and how, and what's the shape of it, and relate and reflect. And so in our training programs, in our courses, I mean, there's so much to unpack here related to just understanding doing this consistently and effectively. And that is where, we want to impart to others that this can be done. But it's an intentional thing, and that's where the identity of mindset really comes into play. If you start there and then you exercise these, it can transform. I want to make sure that we leave some time for questions. Let's do this. Let's open up. Becky, you may have received some. I'm going to hand it over to you for questions.
And this is where you get to engage Michael. Hello, Michael.
Absolutely.
Yes. So I'm going to come back on camera, and Michael's going to come back on camera. I had a really wonderful, insightful question from Andrea that I'd love to get your take on as we begin. She's wondering how we know that our mindset is the message that should be imparted.
Oh, I love that.
I don't know who wants to take that one.
Okay. It's a good question, and maybe take the lead on that one quickly. I believe where there's passion, there's the right mindset to impart to somebody else. And the whole discussion that we had, Derek, Bill, and I, on this book and on the methodology started with our own passions. And we kind of aligned them and said, what is our mission in life? What are our passions in life? And what is it that we want to bring forth in other people? And so because we were aligned on our passion side, we knew what we wanted to talk about. We knew what we wanted to impart mindsets on. And the same, I think, is true for everybody else. If your passion is in it, then the mindset that you try to relate to others is the right one. It's always heart before technique. So we have a great technique here, but it's your heart that actually determines whether whatever you say and whatever you impart is the right thing to do.
But I would add, Michael, that mining that out is important, right? Sometimes it's obvious to you and sometimes it's not. And when we talk about leadership mindset, one of the first things we start with is what is your leadership purpose and the principles that guide you and defining that out. And so really engaging that can be pivotal in communicating the right mindsets, because sometimes you're not aware of what those mindsets are.
Yeah. And I love the question because I think it validates one of the most common questions we get asked. What should I mindset on, right? And how do I know it's the right one? And I think that's a great question, right? And I love the tying to the purpose and the principles, right? And then you use the tool. That's
Sure.
awesome.
So here's another question going back to this idea of passing the baton with communication. Catherine mentions that she's seen people nod, agree, affirm, and then later it's clear that the person didn't receive the message. So do the three of you have any tips about how we can solve that issue?
I think the beauty lies in the third R, in the reflect part. Because the relate part is a substantiation of our message, obviously. So we try to relate it with a great, we call it a fit example. So something that's focused, inspiring, and tangible. But the real beauty lies in the third R, in the reflect part. And only if we get another person to reflect upon what we try to message to them and relate to them, only then will we be able to make sure that the nodding is not just a nodding, but it actually has an impact on people.
Yeah.
Well, and then you re-engage it, right, in that 3R to the end, and you come back again and again, and it's clarification, it's refining, and it's embedment.
Yeah. And right, because I think that's great, the ability to get them to relate out loud, and you can ask them questions, right? This is where we say activities and exercises, as they're nodding their head, you can ask questions. Tell me what that means to you. Tell me, what you're thinking right now. How would your life, remember the reflect, as Michael said, if you're in the reflect stage, how would this change your life? See, it's great that you're shaking your head and giving positive affirmation, but I'm curious, what do you think would change in your life if you did this, right? Because that is now, that's no more excuses for that other person. They need to come up with something to say. It's not just shaking their head. And you'll be able to see as the receiver pretty quick, just like we do in academia as a teacher or facilitators, whether somebody's just positive affirmation just to move on to the next section or whether they're really getting it. Great question.
Sure. So I like this question that came in from Michael. He's wondering about that story at the beginning, William, about Mr. Oliver, and he's wondering if that kid in the story is one of you.
Ah, interesting. Derek.
You want to go
yeah.
there?
Absolutely. So that's a great tee up. So I would like to introduce my son. And I love that question because my son was that 16-year-old boy that I humbly say as a parent was lost, absolutely lost. And, when we think about, what we say, Michael shared it with everybody that before we even started this project, we had this meeting and it just, what are we about? What's our purpose in life? And the three of us came together and we had no idea what we were going to say, but we were, in awe of how close we were related. And it comes back to the simple premise that, for all of us, there is a purpose. And for me and, the ability to look at Mr. Oliver as an example of a mindsetter and look at my son that was struggling, but because of one person that was able to inspire and influence and impact. People ask us, is this whole project personal? Is it business? Well, I'm here to tell you, for me, it's personal. I've seen firsthand what a mindsetter can do for my son. I've seen firsthand what it can do for my family, right?
Yeah.
That's pretty cool stuff. So you betcha it's personal for me. And that's what gets me fired up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to add to this, just one comment there is, for us, the most important thing about the whole project is that we want to ignite this mindsetter movement, because we believe that there are a lot of mindsetters in this world, a lot of people that have something important to say, and we want to engage with them and want to affirm them that their role is important. We want to equip them as much as we can, but we also want to help them to be part of something and have an identity that they feel confident about.
That's right. Right. And
That's a really
remember,
great transition, but can I just pause for one quick second? There were a few people who wanted to comment how grateful they are for your vulnerability and authenticity and sharing that personal story.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that you all have some parting thoughts as we wrap up the hour.
Yeah. Well, and I would say just that is the hallmark of this for us is this is a personal, authentic journey, and we really believe that there's a calling to shape the dialogue for this next era of influence and leadership. We've talked a lot about servant leaders and all kinds of things and as Bill said, incredible people have said much about this, and we want to capitalize on this. But we think there's a new dialogue to be had, a new sense of identity where people say, hey, I'm a mindsetter. I really own that from the very beginning. This is something that I believe, and this is something I'm willing to commit to, and this is going to shape the way that I engage people. And we started with what is really just the basic building blocks. What is the communication model? In this book, it's really a roadmap. I mean, it just unpacks how to do that in an effective way, but more than that, we want to call people. We really do. We want to call ourselves and others to stand up and say, I'm a mindsetter. And I accept that and I embrace that, and it shapes the way I think, it shapes the way I craft, it shapes the way I engage, it shapes the way I re-engage other people. And whatever the areas that I'm mindset on, leadership, coaching, parenting, whatever, I'm intentional about that. And this is the journey that I'm on. So we're asking for people to follow, to join the movement, to be a mindsetter with us. And in fact, as the words of, the question is, are you in the words of the immortal master himself, right? A mindsetter you are. Come join the movement. Have fun with this. Be a mindsetter. We want you to join us. Thank you so much for the privilege to be able to share that with you and to be on this journey.
Sure. Thank you so much, guys. So you can get the book, and I'll be sending some follow-up after this call with ways that you can get in touch with the authors. I had a couple of people asking toward the end of the hour, is there a way to get directly in touch with the authors? There is indeed a way, and I will put you in connection with them with my follow-up email. Also, an appreciation for your attendance at the webinar. The authors have created this special opportunity in the next 48 hours for you to sign up to have a special additional chat with them, a fireside chat. And I'll share some details of that when I send you the follow-up email. Also, I have about 7 or 8 copies of the book in my office that we're going to give away. So if you can email me, Becky at weavinginfluence.com, some feedback about this event and what you learned, and tell me in the subject line that you want to be a mindsetter, and we'll choose from those and get the book out to 7 of you after this event. So thanks again so much for joining us today, and we really look forward to continuing this conversation as we build this movement of mindsetters. My email address again is becky@weavinginfluence.com. If you have any of the invitations that you received from the webinar, you should be able to reply to those and get back to me with feedback about the webinar and have a chance to win one of the books that we're going to send out. William, Derek, Michael, thank you.
Thank you
A pleasure.
for being here.